John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, famous fantasy author of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, professional and esteemed philologist, from an already renowned household name when he was alive to even dizzier heights with the film adaptations by Peter Jackson and whatever tritonous Amazon is masquerading these days as Lord of the Rings. He's recognized as the founding father, or a founding father, of the modern fantasy genre. And although he's known for his love of all things medieval and Middle Ages, this video is going to examine the influence of the Renaissance on his work, specifically Sir Philip Sidney's defense of Poesy and Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. There's plenty of interesting things to cover between Tolkien and Shakespeare, like, for instance, Tolkien subverting many of the aspects of Macbeth, and, relevant to this channel, an infamous newspaper article depicting collegiate Tolkien espousing Baconian Shakespeare authorship claims. But as I said, maybe we'll save that for another video. And setting aside the quarrels Tolkien had with Shakespeare and Michael Drayton, and perhaps a soft spot for Spencer, Tolkien in general seems to be associated with a distaste for the Renaissance, perhaps for its association with the beginning of the dreaded modernity. Also of note as we continue, I sometimes use poesy and fiction interchangeably, as this is the definition that Sidney is using in his defense of Poesy. His critique, I will be using part of Tonya Caroline Wood's essay, Is Tolkien a Renaissance Man? Sir Philip Sidney's defense of Poesy, and J.R.R. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, where she shows they parallel not only on a structural level, but a thematic one too, with Tolkien defending fantasy within fiction, and Sidney defending fiction as a whole. These two pieces together act as an insightful guide to the creative process, and gives thoughtful prescriptions to story crafting, the magic sauce, if you will, that anyone of that inclination would benefit from reading. Here in this video, I'll be reviewing and commenting on Wood's work, and adding some of my own comparison notes between the two texts, especially as it relates to the process of an almost now tritely regurgitated suspension of disbelief concept, or as Tolkien defines as a secondary belief, a figuring forth of a speaking picture, as Sidney preludes. There is no concrete evidence that Tolkien ever read Sidney, although perhaps it should be assumed he was familiar since his colleague C.S. Lewis wrote on Sidney, but maybe Tolkien avoided Sidney due to the latter's renown as a Protestant poster boy. Woods, in her notes, claims that Loris Topcliffe, librarian at Exeter College where Tolkien spent undergrad, saw him take out books on, quote, grammar, the history of language, and a bit of Shakespeare, but nothing specifically about Sidney's defense of poetry. Seems like Tolkien's definitely having a love-hate thing here with Shakespeare. Oxford rhetorician. Both Sidney and Tolkien were learned in classical rhetoric via their Oxford tutelage and mixed aspects of their encomium, which praises and elevates its subject, with aspects of the defense, which vindicates an accused subject. According to Sir Brian Vickers, renowned orthodox Shakespeare scholar, this style of epididactic rhetoric was a dominant mode of the Renaissance, perhaps giving us a new look on Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, and that we can realize it was a carefully crafted argument that aimed at reform in the literary scene, not unlike what Sidney's defense of Poesy did for his era. Aphthenonius, in his Progymnasmata, organizes the encomium into the promium, the introduction, genos, discussion of the subject's family, and atrophy, bringing up of the subject, praxis, praise of the subject's accomplishments, synchrisis, comparison, and epilogos, conclusion. Sidney and Tolkien use the same principles of Aphthenonius with a few alterations, like spinning a considerable portion to the refutatio. Wood's essay goes into a much deeper analysis on identifying which parts of the argument are assigned where and how, but I'm going to give a much briefer rundown and aim to not be so technical. Aristotle's rhetoric states that the encomium must emphasize the virtue and importance of the subject, and that amplification is the rhetorical figure most suitable, since it endows the subject with beauty and importance. Below is a comparison of Sidney and Tolkien's verbiage to describe their subject, aiming at correlating them with virtue and traits of morality. Sidney on Poesy: highest knowledge, venerable, valiant, nobles, courage, excellency, triumphers, ornament, heavenly, excellent, peerless, golden, highest, treasure house. Compare to Tolkien on Fantasy: inherent morality, wisdom, virtuous, noble, ideal, heroic, dignity, pure, higher, richness, wealth. Both at the start of their essays employ a common feature of encomium of displaying a modest personality, a profession of shortcomings in regards to the subject. Sidney laments his ineptness at having to make a, quote, pitiful defense of poor poetry at the beginning and later calls his essay an ink-wasting toy. Tolkien similarly claims he is but a wandering explorer, unprofessional, impertinent, and that he can only offer hints and has not the learning nor the skill nor necessary wisdom which with the subject of fairy story demands. And he hopes that we will accept his essay of withered leaves. Ironies abound from both these Englishmen. Tolkien tries to claim he is but a, quote, reader and lover of fairy stories, not an expert or even a student of them. For that matter, likewise, Sidney also tries to garner some leniency of bearing with his essay by undercutting himself, saying that he as the scholar is to be pardoned for merely trying to follow in the steps of the master in his attempt to uphold Poesy. I think that they would both hide behind the master ye phrase, a true master is an eternal student. And you know they are both masters because both defensive poetry and unfairy stories undoubtedly change their respective literary scenes. Both writers lament on the poor state of fairy stories, or poesy and fiction, in their respective eras in England, and suggest some sort of correction is needed. Tolkien in letters bemoans the English literature ended with Chaucer in that he graved for the poverty of his beloved country, having no story of its own. Although Tolkien is terse about Shakespeare and Michael Drayton's role in diminutizing the fairy archetype and on fairy stories, and in a separate letter, he will credit Edmund Spenser for maintaining the true traditional heritage of fairy lore, as he footnotes in the same letter, a murrain on William Shakespeare and his damn cobwebs. Although Sidney is dead before Shakespeare is on the scene, and the fact we on the channel claim Shakespeare is a direct development from Sidney's ideas in Defense of Poesy, ironically both he and Tolkien agree on some merits of Chaucer and Edmund Spenser. Side note is that Sidney finds the purposefully archaic English syntax of Spenser to be forced. In contrast, I wonder if Tolkien got more of a kick from this gimmick and filled his monarchy cup. Sidney hopes Defensive Poesy will spur on a new wave of art, guided by his critique, to, quote, bend to the right use of both matter and manner, or else be, quote, want of an epitaph. And if you take our Apocalypsis Historia thesis that Shakespeare and co. are inheritors of Sidney's critique on English, this directly mirrors Tolkien's objective with On Fairy Stories, to provide a framework for building better fantasy tropes and procedures, and thus better literature. In fact, Tolkien in a letter will claim that Lord of the Rings was, quote, a practical demonstration of On Fairy Stories. Now compare two passages from Tolkien and Sidney describing the uncanny ability of human nature to subcreate new forms from God's nature. Sidney first. Only the poet, disdaining to be tied to any such subjection, lifted up with the vigors of his own invention, doth grow and effect into another nature, in making things either better than nature brings forth, or quite new, forms such as never were in nature, as the heroes, demigods, cyclops, chimeras, furies, and such like, so as he goes hand in hand with nature, not enclosed within the narrow warrant of her gifts, but freely ranging within the zodiac of his own wit. Nature never set forth the earth in such a rich tapestry as divers poets have done, neither with pleasant rivers, fruitful trees, sweet-smelling flowers, nor whatsoever else may make the too much loved earth more lovely. Her world is brazen, the poet's only delivers a golden. Compared to Tolkien. We can take green from grass, blue from heaven, and red from blood. We have already an enchanter's power upon one plane, and the desire so wield that power in the world external to our mind awakes. It does not follow that we shall use that power well upon any plane. We may put a deadly green upon a man's face and produce a horror. We may make the rare and terrible blue moon to shine, or we may cause woods to spring with silver leaves and rams to wear fleeces of gold, and put hot fire into the belly of the cold worm. But in such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made. Fairy begins. Man becomes a sub-creator. Fantastic figures, from green men to the Furies. Sidney and Tolkien, both referencing Greek myths, both marvel at the ability of humanity to sub-create within nature. Interestingly enough, while straddling the Christian framework, both Sidney and Tolkien employ a Cicerone phrase to defend against the accusations of potential moral misuse of poesy and fantasy. Sidney: what? Shall the abuse of a thing make the right use odious? Tolkien: absusus non tollit usum. Abuse does not take away use. Christian imagery. Both Sidney and Tolkien have been recognized as leading figures within their respective denominations. Sidney for Protestants and Tolkien for Catholics, and both employ biblical references in their argumentation. In some ironies, I think plenty of pagans and heathens also find consent with these two Christians. As Sidney dives into the etymology of the word poet, he finds it from the Greek poen, which means to make, ergo the poet is a maker. So Sidney endows the title, the, quote, right honor to that heavenly maker of that maker, who, having made man to his own likeness, set him beyond and over all the works of that second nature, which in nothing he shows so much as in poetry, when with the force of a divine breath he brings things forth far surpassing her doings, with no small argument to the incredulous of that first accursed fall of man. Since our erected wit makes us know what perfection is, and yet our infected will keeps us from reaching unto it. But these arguments will by few be understood, and by few are granted. Thus much I hope will be given me, that the Greeks with some probability of reason gave him the name of all names of learning. Chef's kiss, Sidney. Hyperstitional wordplay is my fetish around here, I'll admit. Tolkien likewise pays homage to the heavenly maker, and the derived power of creation in man from God when he nearly identically echoes Sidney with his assertion that, quote, fantasy remains a human right. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. And just as Sidney does, Tolkien acknowledges that fallen man has its hang-ups like misuse, staining the elves or fantasy with his own stain, and that it is subjugated to the beauty of God's original creation. The will has the power of making immediately effective the visions of fantasy, but Tolkien here would agree with Sidney that its infection humbles us in light of God's work. In Sidney's words, there is no art delivered unto mankind that has not the works of nature for his principal object, without which they could not consist, and on which they so depend as they become actors and players, as it were, of what nature will have set forth. Compared to Tolkien, for creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun, on a recognition of fact, but not a slavery to it. Fiction and fantasy is for adults too. The two essayists both defend the accusation that their subject is explicitly for children, and thus juvenile. Sidney says poor Poesy is in such a dismal state that it has fallen to be a laughingstock of children. Tolkien also thinks this is an error, and that Sidney thinks the value in fantasy is thus not to be founded by considering children in particular. Compare their sentiments about good literature being able to reach all ages, and if done particularly well, will accompany a child from youth till adulthood and beyond, revealing deeper insights and strengthening their morality, aging like a fine wine in their psyche. Compare Sidney and Tolkien. Sidney first. But he comes to you with words set in delightful proportion, either accompanied with, or prepared for, the well-enchanting skill of music. And with a tale, forsooth, he comes unto you, with a tale which holds children from play, and old men from the chimney corner, and, pretending no more, doth intend the winning of the mind from wickedness to virtue, even as the child is often brought to take the most wholesome things, by hiding them in such other as to have a pleasant taste, which, if one should begin to tell them the nature of the aloes or rhubarb they should receive, would soon take their physic at their ears and at their mouth. Tolkien. If fairy story as a kind is worth reading at all, it is worthy to be written for and read by adults. They will, of course, put more in and get more out than children. Then, as a branch of genuine art, children may hope to get fairy stories fit for them to read, and yet within their measure, as they may hope to get suitable introductions to poetry, history, and the sciences, though it may be better for them to read some things, especially fairy tales, that are beyond their measure rather than short of it. Their books, like their clothes, should allow for growth, and their books at any rate should encourage it. Fiction's true fantasy. Here's where I want to talk about Tolkien's coinage of secondary belief and sub-creation, as well as Sidney's etymological analysis of the word poet. Let's get both Sidney and Tolkien's alleged goal for fiction and fantasy on the table, as they both attempt to describe the magic, with a K, of this phenomena in which the listener can partake in the story with the teller. From Sidney. Neither let this be jestingly conceived, because the works of the one be essential, the other an imitation or fiction, for any understanding knows the skill of each artificer stands in that idea, or foreconceit of the work, and not in the work itself, and that the poet has that idea is manifest, by delivering them forth in such excellency as he had imagined them. From Tolkien. What really happens is that the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it, while you are, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. The magic, or rather art, has failed. You are then out in the primary world again, looking at the little abortive second world from outside. The true magic of storytelling is that suspension of disbelief, when we become captivated by the plot and characters mixed with the perfect concoction of fantastical elements, with just enough of what reminds us of home, of the profane and mundane, of what the quote is unquote true. The successful transmission of a story in one's mind to another. The mental faculty of the mind's eye's ability to imagine is also touched on by both writers. From Sidney, poesy, or fiction, therefore, is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle terms it in his word mimesis, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth. To speak metaphorically, a speaking picture with this end, to teach and delight. From Tolkien. The mental power of image making is one thing, or aspect, and it should be appropriately be called imagination, the perception of the image, the grasp of its implications, and the control, which are necessary to a successful expression, may vary in vividness and strength, but this is a difference of degree in imagination, not a difference in kind. The achievement of the expression, which gives, or seems to give, the inner consistency of reality, is indeed another thing or aspect needing another name. Art, with a capital A, the operative link between imagination and the final result, sub-creation. A figuring forth of a speaking picture, the image-making imaginers sharing the perception of the same image from the poet, from the writer. What gives the image maker his power? As Sidney says, the foreconceit, the idea, ideos, the form he envisioned to bestow on the image receiver. Not a hastily summoned entity full of plot holes and incongruencies, but a fully realized conception, which makes the final result all the more crystal clear. Let it be said that Sidney and Tolkien are philologists at heart, if not also professionally, which I argue is why the literature is so powerful and long-lasting. They're literally spellcasters. The unacknowledged magic sauce seems to be the words, the language itself. Be it etymological rabbit holes or linguistic gymnastic practice, they demonstrate a love of the craft. What are books and sonnets and novels other than words? Here are evidence from both authors. From Sidney in a letter to Hubert Languet. I shall first take one of Cicero's letters and turn it into French, then from French into English, and so once more by a sort of perpetual motion, but not of Abondius' sort. It shall come round into the Latin again. Perhaps, too, I shall improve myself in Italian by the same exercise. It's like a grammatical alchemist, changing forms of words into others and then back into their original form again. In the same letter referenced earlier, where Tolkien mentions Shakespeare's cobwebs, he also has this to say about the impetus and origin of Lord of the Rings. And he says, in order of time, growth, and composition, this stuff began with me. I mean, I do not remember a time when I was not building it. Many children make up, or begin to make up, imaginary languages. I have been at it since I could write, but I have never stopped, and of course, as a professional philologist, especially interested in linguistic aesthetics, I have changed in taste, improved in theory, and probably in craft. Behind my stories is now a nexus of languages. That line there about Tolkien saying he does not remember a time he is not engaged with these literary ideas and fantasy reminds me of Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella, number 1, last line. This incessant need to create. He says, "Fool," said my muse to me, "look in thy heart and write." Thank you for watching Apocalypsis Historia. Consider donating or joining Patreon for exclusive perks with the links down below. Special announcement, Chance and I will be running an Apocalypsis Historia online course featuring our first run of the Wizard Plays class, featuring one play a week for all of February going into March. Get historical context of each play and the Apocalypsis Historia close reading methods of the text. Take notes like a real Renaissance scholar with a commonplace book project assignment. The only grade is how much fun you have. Email us at apocalypsishistoria@gmail.com for more information.